In the jungles of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers learned to count American victories in wrecked machines. A tank destroyed meant progress. A blow against an enemy stretched thin across an ocean. But then something unsettling happened. The same tank they destroyed appeared again. And again. And again. Overnight, where wreckage once smoldered, new steel rolled forward, louder, heavier, unstoppable. It was at that moment, deep in the mud and heat of island warfare, that Japan realized it was not fighting an army. It was fighting an industrial force with no visible end. Before the Pacific War exploded into full view, Imperial Japan had already chosen how it intended to fight. Japanese military doctrine was built on urgency and spirit. The Army and Navy believed wars were decided quickly, through surprise, momentum, and decisive blows delivered before an enemy could fully react. This thinking had been shaped by victories against China in the 1930s and by the stunning defeat of Russia decades earlier. Speed, discipline, and aggressive maneuver mattered more than prolonged industrial warfare. Japan did not plan for a long conflict. It planned to win fast or not at all. That philosophy was driven as much by necessity as belief. Japan was an industrial power, but a limited one. The empire lacked domestic oil, depended heavily on imported steel, and possessed only modest reserves of key raw materials. By 1941, more than 80% of its oil came from abroad. When the United States and its allies imposed embargoes, Japan's leaders understood the clock had started ticking. Every mile of supply line, from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to the factories of Honshu, became a fragile lifeline, vulnerable to interruption. Nowhere were these limits clearer than in Japanese armored doctrine. Tanks were not conceived as independent breakthrough weapons, as in German blitzkrieg theory. They were infantry support tools, meant to advance alongside foot soldiers, suppress machine gun nests, and exploit weak points. Japanese tanks reflected this role. Most weighed under 15 tons. Vehicles like the Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Kaiha were lightly armored, modestly armed, and designed for mobility rather than survivability. Against colonial forces in China or Southeast Asia, they were often sufficient. Against modern anti-tank weapons, they were not. Across the Pacific, the United States was awakening to a completely different kind of war. After December 1941, American industry shifted with astonishing speed. Automobile factories in Detroit were retooled into tank plants. Shipyards expanded around the clock. Aircraft production multiplied month by month. In 1940, the United States had produced fewer than 400 tanks. By 1942, that number would rise into the tens of thousands. Civilian consumption was curtailed, rationing introduced, and a vast workforce mobilized. America was not just fighting, it was manufacturing its way into dominance. But in the war's opening months, Japanese commanders saw little reason to worry. In the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces advanced with confidence. Allied defenses collapsed faster than expected. American and British equipment was destroyed or abandoned. Each enemy tank knocked out, each aircraft burned on the ground, reinforced the belief that material losses were decisive. Japan assumed that destroying American machines weakened American resolve. What Japanese planners did not yet grasp was the imbalance hidden beneath the surface. To Japan, every tank lost was painful and difficult to replace. To the United States, it was a temporary setback, already being addressed by factories thousands of miles away. The empire believed attrition favored the bold. It had not yet learned that in this war, replacement would matter more than courage, and that America could replace almost anything that was lost. The center of gravity of America's war effort was not a beachhead or a battlefield. It was the factory floor. Far from the Pacific Front, the United States mainland transformed itself into an industrial engine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Assembly lines that once produced automobiles now produced weapons of war, operating day and night, under electric lights that never went dark. In Warren, Michigan, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant became a symbol of this transformation. Opened in 1941 and run by Chrysler, it reached a pace so relentless that at peak production, a completed tank rolled off the line roughly every hour. Not every week, not every day, every hour. This was not craftsmanship in the old sense. It was industrial warfare. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built more than 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks. They were produced not as individual machines, but as standardized components assembled into fighting vehicles. Engines, transmissions, turrets, tracks, all designed to be interchangeable. If a Sherman broke down in the field, mechanics did not attempt delicate reconstruction. They replaced entire modules. A damaged engine could be swapped out in hours. A destroyed tank could be written off without halting operations. Another was already on the way. This philosophy extended beyond tanks. It defined how America fought. The battlefield was supported by an invisible supply chain that stretched from steel mills to rail yards to ports, crossing oceans with predictable regularity. Crews trained knowing that if their vehicle was lost, another would replace it. Survival did not depend on preserving the machine at all costs. The machine existed to be used and expended if necessary. The Sherman itself embodied this mindset. It was not the most heavily armored tank of the war. It was not the most powerful. Its 75 gun was adequate, its armor respectable but vulnerable. What it was, above all, was reliable. Easy to drive, easy to maintain, easy to mass produce. The Sherman could operate in heat, mud, jungle, and dust. It could be shipped across oceans, unloaded, fueled, and thrown into combat with minimal delay. Across the Pacific, Japanese armored units lived under a different reality. Japanese tanks were built in small numbers, often with hand-fitted parts that resisted standardization. Spare components were scarce. Repair depots were limited. When tanks were damaged, crews frequently had no choice but to abandon them. Wrecks were stripped for usable parts, cannibalized to keep a handful of vehicles running. Each loss narrowed the margin for survival. Each destroyed tank weakened the unit permanently. This difference was not merely logistical, it was psychological. American tank crews went into battle expecting continuity. Losses were painful but not final. The system behind them absorbed shock and restored strength. Japanese crews understood that replacement was unlikely. Their tanks were finite, their machines irreplaceable. Each engagement carried the weight of permanence. Two armies were preparing to meet, not just with weapons but with worldviews. One backed by an assembly line that never stopped moving. The other constrained by scarcity and distance. Soon these philosophies would collide face to face, in jungle clearings and muddy roads, where steel met steel, and industrial power became brutally personal. The realization did not come all at once. It arrived slowly under fire and then all at once at dawn. In June 1944, on the island of Saipan, Japanese infantry finally confronted the full weight of American armored warfare. The island was vital, part of the Mariana chain that would place U.S. bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. When U.S. Marines of the V Amphibious Corps came ashore on June 15, they brought with them tanks in numbers Japan had rarely faced in the Pacific. M4 Shermans landing from LSDs directly onto contested beaches. The Japanese defenders understood their weakness. Their own tanks were few, obsolete, and largely unsuited to head-on engagements. Anti-tank guns were scarce and often ineffective against American armor. What remained was infantry courage and close-range tactics. As darkness fell, Japanese soldiers moved forward in small groups. They crept through shell holes and sugarcane fields, carrying satchel charges, magnetic mines, and bundles of explosives. These were not long-range battles. They were measured in feet. At night, Shermans burned. Japanese assault teams struck tracks, engine decks, and thin rear armor. Some crawled beneath the hulls. Others rushed forward in desperate charges, knowing there would be no retreat. Several American tanks were disabled or destroyed in these nighttime attacks. By dawn, the battlefield was littered with blackened steel. For Japanese infantrymen, it felt like proof that sacrifice still mattered, that American machines could be stopped. Then the sun rose. As morning light cut through the smoke, fresh tanks began rolling inland from the beaches. New Shermans, clean and intact, with the same silhouettes and the same engine noise. Replacement crews climbed into vehicles that looked indistinguishable from those destroyed hours earlier. Behind them came armored recovery vehicles, bulldozers pushing wrecks aside, engineers reopening routes. This was not coincidence, it was design. Offshore, floating depots and repair ships held spare parts and replacement vehicles. Damaged tanks that could be salvaged were pulled back, repaired, and returned to service. Those that could not were replaced outright. American logistics had anticipated losses and absorbed them without pause. Prepositioned reserves ensured that armored strength did not dwindle, it regenerated. Japanese soldiers began to notice a pattern that defied experience. Tanks destroyed during the night were present again by afternoon. Units reported knocking out American armor, only to face equal or greater numbers the next day. There was no visible reduction, no thinning of force. The steel kept returning. For the Japanese infantrymen in a foxhole or cave, this realization cut deeply. Courage was still demanded. Sacrifice was still expected, but the battlefield had changed. The enemy was no longer a finite presence that could be worn down by bravery alone. It was a system, vast, methodical, and unrelenting. By the end of the fighting on Saipan, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Not because the Japanese lacked resolve, but because resolve could not compete with replacement. Steel returned at dawn. And with it came the understanding that this war would not be decided by heroism alone. For much of the war, Japanese soldiers had believed in endurance. Imperial Army training taught that victory belonged to the side that could suffer longer. Hardship was expected. Casualties were endured without complaint. The enemy, it was believed, would eventually weaken, his morale cracking under pressure, his will eroding as losses mounted. This belief had held true in earlier campaigns, where opponents lacked the depth to recover. In the Pacific, however, that assumption began to collapse. By 1944, the battlefield told a different story. On islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and later Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders watched American forces absorb punishment that should have stalled any advance. Tanks destroyed in one assault were replaced before the next. Artillery positions silenced at dawn were active again by afternoon. Aircraft shot down over the beach were followed by new formations overhead the next day. American air power, naval gunfire, artillery, and armor operated as a single system, coordinated and relentless. For Japanese soldiers in caves and trenches, the psychological effect was devastating. They fought for weeks without relief, often without adequate food or water. Ammunition dwindled, medical care was minimal, wounded comrades were rarely evacuated. As days turned into nights, exhaustion became constant. Yet the enemy did not appear to weaken. Instead, American units rotated out of the line. Fresh troops took their place. The wounded were carried back to field hospitals, evacuated by landing craft, treated, and often returned to duty. Destroyed equipment disappeared and was replaced without ceremony. This contrast was impossible to ignore. American doctrine assumed losses and planned for them. Units were relieved, crews were replaced, machines were expendable. The system preserved fighting strength over time. Japanese doctrine allowed no such flexibility. Retreat was dishonor. Surrender was unthinkable. Units fought until they were shattered, then ceased to exist. Every loss was permanent. The war had become asymmetrical. On one side stood a force that bled but healed, that lost equipment but regenerated strength. On the other stood an army that bled until it was gone. Japanese soldiers continued to fight with courage, but courage no longer translated into strategic effect. Destroying an American tank or killing an American soldier no longer shifted the balance. The replacement arrived too quickly. The pressure never lifted. By the later stages of the Pacific War, Japanese commanders understood what their soldiers felt in their bones. Attrition no longer favored endurance. It favored production, logistics, and time. Yet there was no mechanism to change course. There were no reserves to rotate in, no industrial surge to draw upon, no relief waiting offshore. The truth was clear, but it came too late. The battlefield was no longer a contest of wills alone. It was a collision between systems, and one of them could not be worn down. By the final years of the war, the truth had reached Tokyo. Field reports from the Pacific spoke with growing consistency. American forces were described as possessing endless material, a phrase that appeared again and again in intelligence summaries and after-action reports. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ships arrived in quantities that defied traditional calculations of loss and gain. Battles that should have exhausted an enemy instead strengthened him. For Japan's senior commanders, this was no longer a tactical problem. It was a structural one. At home, the foundations of Japan's war effort were eroding. American strategic bombing steadily damaged industrial capacity. While the Pacific theater was not initially the focus of mass bombing, by 1944 B-29 superfortresses were striking aircraft plants, steelworks, and later entire urban industrial centers. More damaging still was the collapse of shipping. U.S. submarines, operating with increasing effectiveness, sank merchant vessels faster than Japan could replace them. Oil tankers were lost. Fuel stockpiles shrank. By late 1944, the Imperial Navy was forced to curtail training and operations due to shortages of aviation fuel. Without fuel, factories could not run. Without shipping, raw materials could not reach them. Without industry, replacement became impossible. On the battlefield, American tanks had taken on symbolic weight. They were no longer just weapons advancing with infantry. They represented an imbalance that could not be corrected. Each Sherman destroyed was a temporary inconvenience. Each Japanese tank lost was a permanent reduction in strength. Commanders understood this disparity, even as they sent soldiers forward to fight regardless. Strategy shifted accordingly. Japanese defensive doctrine moved away from counterattacks and toward fortified, layered defenses designed to delay rather than defeat. On islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the goal was no longer to throw the enemy back into the sea. It was to extract maximum cost, to slow the advance, to buy time, time that might force political change or negotiation. Victory on the battlefield was no longer expected. Endurance was all that remained. This shift marked a profound change in purpose. The war Japan had entered to secure resources and regional dominance had become a struggle to preserve honor and shape memory. Commanders knew they could not outproduce, outmaneuver, or outlast the American system. Yet the machinery of war continued to turn, driven by obligation, ideology, and the absence of alternatives. By the end, Japanese leaders no longer asked how to win. They asked how to endure. What remained was not the possibility of victory, but the question of what legacy would be left behind when the fighting finally stopped. By the time the guns fell silent in the Pacific, the lesson had been written in wreckage and numbers. Imperial Japan did not lose the war because American tanks were individually superior. In many cases, they were not. The M4 Sherman was vulnerable, imperfect, and often outmatched in armor or firepower by later designs. What Japan faced, and ultimately could not overcome, was something far more decisive: replacement. The ability to absorb loss, erase damage, and return strength to the battlefield faster than an enemy could destroy it. World War II redefined what victory meant. For centuries, wars had been decided by leadership, maneuver, courage, and tactical brilliance. In the industrial age, those qualities still mattered, but they were no longer enough. The Pacific War revealed that factories, shipping lanes, and logistics networks could be as decisive as divisions and fleets. Steel poured from assembly lines translated directly into momentum at the front. A destroyed tank, aircraft, or ship no longer marked a turning point. It became an accounting entry. This realization reshaped military thinking across the world. After 1945, no major power planned for war without considering sustainment. Armies reorganized around supply chains. Air forces calculated sortie rates based on production capacity. Navies measured strength not just in hulls afloat, but in shipyards and fuel reserves. Manufacturing itself became a strategic weapon, integrated into national defense planning. The war had proven that endurance belonged not only to soldiers, but to systems. Yet this lesson came at an immense human cost. The same factories that replaced American losses also enabled destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Tanks rolling off assembly lines meant battles that never paused. Airframes built faster than they could be shot down meant skies that never emptied. Industrial efficiency saved countless American lives by ensuring superiority, but it also prolonged fighting, intensified bombardment, and multiplied the devastation inflicted on those caught beneath it. In the Pacific, this reality became painfully clear to Japanese soldiers on the ground. They faced an enemy that did not weaken with sacrifice. Courage no longer translated into advantage. Heroism did not slow production. The tank that appeared again at dawn carried a meaning beyond its armor and gun. It was proof that the war was no longer a contest between men alone. It was a contest between nations organized for total conflict. The steel that returned overnight was not just metal. It was a message. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers learned that destroying a machine meant nothing if the enemy could simply build another before sunrise.